Red's Fly Shop, this is Bob. How may I help you today?
Look at that. Woo! Hi, it's Joe at Red's Fly Shop here. Hey, I want to talk to you do-it-yourself anglers, especially the wade fishermen today, and I want to explain, well, a couple of things. One, the power of just delicate or light line nymphing, and we won't talk about tight line nymphing as far as instructional in this video today. I really want to talk to you about yarn and how advantageous yarn is for the angler that's on foot, picking apart water, hopefully in somewhat of a surgical fashion, and not the angler that's just cruising downstream fishing 10 miles in a drift boat. So I'm going to talk you through kind of how I set my indicators up, talk to you a little bit about being able to customize your indicators and how I set my leader up. I've been guiding over 2 decades now. I've tried everything that there is, and I've really reverted back over long term to some of the original rigs that I originally used. So we'll dive in and I'll show you how it works today. Also, if you like the good fly fishing content, like and subscribe. It helps. You get notified when we got new videos up. And then comments are welcome. Several days a week I sit down and respond to comments. So make sure you ask questions in the comments and just feel free to engage. So I have 3 different sizes of yarn indicators here that I tied in. And the first thing I want to explain is, depending on the weight and depth of your Nymph rig, your indicator needs to be altered and changed in addition. So for instance, if I'm fishing, I'll just, with respect to video length, I won't drag out a whole bunch of flies. Let's just say you're fishing a little size number 16 pheasant tail, and you tie that onto an indicator like this, your traditional 3/4 inch thingamabobber. I carry a bunch. I use them in very specific circumstances, high, boily, dirty, swift water with big flies. And I've got airlocks in there. I've got thingamabobbers. I've tried the Oros ones. And if those work for you, shoot, I'm not going to try to talk you out of that and tell you not to do it. But I think there's better techniques out there, especially for people who are wade fishing and relegated to fishing, say, a 1/4 mile to a mile of river in a day. These are noisy. They make a lot of noise when you cast. They make a lot of noise when you mend. And when you set the hook, they are like dragging a gigantic popper fly across the surface. But if you took one of these, thingamabobbers or an airlock or whatever it is, and you put a very lightweight nymph underneath it, this is so buoyant, it's going to take off, and whatever seam line or current speed this is in, it's going to take off and get moving. The fly has no chance of slowing it down, or a lightweight fly has no chance of slowing it down. The other thing that happens is in strike indicator fishing is if your indicator is laying here and then say 4, 5, 6 feet away, however far you're running, your nymph is over here. They're in very different current speeds. And the nymph doesn't have the ability to bring the indicator over to it. It's just too big of an indicator. The nymph is too light. So we have to scale our indicator systems to match the weight of the flies we're using. And this is one of the biggest mistakes I see do-it-yourself wade fishermen make when they're running indicator rigs. They're just using an indicator or a rig that's way too heavy and big. And if you hike into your favorite hole and the first several casts that you throw, you've alarmed all of the fish in the pool that, hey, you're now under fire and I'm here, you're probably not going to be able to work that water effectively over a long period of time. Inversely, we'll start with the smallest indicator on the rig, and I'll show you a customization that I make, and I found this to be the most effective way to set up a suspension, and I'll just refer to indicator nymphing as suspension nymphing. Is imagine if we had just a little tiny tuft of yarn, we put a little floating on it, and now I've got a piece of yarn that will move. This will move like a feather all over the surface, and the nymph actually has the ability to move the feather across the surface, or in this case, the yarn across the surface, and it can bring the yarn to it. It doesn't hit the water hard. It's silent when I pick up and recast. It's very, very quiet, and I can be sneaky when I pick apart these riffles or holes or pocket water or whatever I happen to be fishing. And the other modification that I make to my yarn indicators, and I'll show you how I set them up real time here in just a second, and a few options for running yarn. I think if you haven't experienced experimented with yarn, it's one of the things that it's a little fickle at first, but once you do it and you commit to it, you're going to reap the rewards of a little bit more care and attention to your setup. And that is, I tie a loop knot with a little tippet ring at the end, and then my tippet would be coming off right there. And I'm just going to demonstrate this real time here, but I'm just going to take a piece of tippet, and I could be setting up for the day, or I could be repairing a break off or whatever it happens to be. Now I have this little tippet ring right here, and I'll tag these products in the video description, and now I've got a tie-in point right here that I can just tie this in. Bada boom, bada bing. I've got a new piece of tippet on my line. Of course, I'd clip the tag if I were actually going fishing. And now look, I've got this hinge right here so that my nymph can actually track over and get directly underneath that yarn. And this moves around and it can hinge, and I find I get a lot more natural presentation out of that system. Now, some of you are looking at this and going, well, it looks like it's fixed. I can't slide my indicator up and down the line. And my response to that is, I would much rather fish a suspension rig where I have delicate tippet. Everything below the indicator is nice, delicate tippet just hanging there. That delicate tippet can now move around underneath the indicator, and that nymph can now wander and follow the fine nuances of the river underneath the strike indicator. And I honestly don't change my depth that much. I run anywhere from 2 feet to maybe 5 or 6 feet, but I don't just change my depth. I get about an average depth of what I'm going to be fishing. I like to run just whatever I think my average water depth is going to be. If I think it's 3 feet deep, I run 3 feet deep. My goal is to hang this fly right over the fish. So if it's, think of it like this, if I'm in 4 feet of water and I can suspend my nymph on a really good drift, just 12 inches off the bottom, those fish are maybe holding 6 or 8 inches off the bottom. I'm asking the fish to just barely move up and open its mouth. Now what happens there is if my nymph is hanging down vertically under this and I ask the fish to lift up, even a small amount, that fish lifts up, grabs, I get a very distinct dunk on that strike indicator, and the delicate nature of yarn, I'm gonna see that strike instantaneously, and because the fish is going down, I get a very positive hookup, and I hook most of the fish in the upper lip that way too, which it's easy on the fish for one, but that hook tends to stay put as well. So I don't typically move my indicator up and down. I will adjust and change my tippet length, which in the course of a day I might break off or I might tangle, and that's an opportune time to make an adjustment, either go shallower if I'm snagging up or if I'm not finding success. I can add a little piece of tippet. That's not too big a deal for me to do that. And what these are, this piece of yarn, the origin of this yarn right here is the New Zealand Strike Indicator Company sells these kits of yarn, and you can actually use the dispensers to just pull that yarn right out, and I can customize the size of indicator that I like to use. Now I'll speak about size of indicator, but first I want to talk a little bit about the New Zealand Strike Indicator system. It's a great system, and that's probably the best way to set it up. I'm not going to set those up in this video today because they have some really good videos on how to set up those systems. But if you're someone who really feels like they want to move that strike indicator up and down the line, the true New Zealand style system is the best. Now, and when it comes to folks who are like, well, I catch plenty of fish, I catch lots of fish, Joe, I don't really need your technical setups. Hey, that's great for you. But I would like to question this, like if the number one most technical fishery on the planet for high stakes fish is in New Zealand, giant fish, very picky, selective. When you spook them, you see them swim away and the game is over. There's a reason that they only fish yarn in New Zealand. So think about that on your local fishery. Maybe there's fish there that you're not getting. Maybe there's not maybe you could get a few more fish. Or I frankly enjoy the delicate nature of fire and casts. I'm just gonna rant here for a second. Clunky rigs. Now, guides fish a little bit differently, and I'll explain that. For me personally, if I can take a yarn indicator the size of this, and I'll comb it out, and you can see how I get all the surface fibers exposed to get floating. And then what I generally do after I run that comb through there, put floating in, I like to give it a little haircut because I'm crazy anal retentive about this, and I want my indicator sitting flat. Bunch of different reasons that I personally like yarn when I'm throwing is when I have a good drift, this yarn gets vertical. It doesn't lay on its side, it doesn't go this way, and I can see that I'm drag free because that nymph is putting down pressure on that indicator and it rolls up. That's one reason. The other reason is one of my favorite ways to fish any western river, and I like tight line nymphing, I like suspension fishing under yarn like this. I like firing stoneflies into the hardest to reach spots, splitting the wickets, splitting the willows, behind log jams, very technical casting spots where I still have to set that nymph down somewhat delicately. When I have a yarn system like this weighs nothing on my cast. All of the weight, now I want to make sure I explain this well, all of the weight on my rig is at the terminal end of the line. So now it's really like throwing a little woolly bugger or a little streamer. I don't have the clunky nature of multiple weights with an indicator and my fly on there. So my casting accuracy is 10x when I've got yarn and a single nymph on the end, which I like a single nymph rig a lot. So I can fire a Pat's rubber leg, a little leech, a little tungsten jig nymph. I can fire that into these hard to reach spots because my casting accuracy and my line speed is way faster. And my sets are way quicker too because there's no water resistance on this, or very, very little. Whereas my bobber grabs a lot of water, and as I go to set, I really feel like that slows down your hook set. So there's a whole bunch of ways. It's pure joy for me. I enjoy it more. Now, when it comes to bobbers, lots of guides, maybe you've been on guide trips, maybe you've used these in the past. The guides are different animals when it comes to how they're running a float trip on a western river. So our guides, they're absolute experts on this water. They're gonna take you downstream, they're gonna hit every seam, they're gonna go left, they're gonna go right, they're gonna go center, they're gonna back up to this rock. They're gonna give you one good drift on each seam. They're not gonna sit and beat on a riffle or a pool or a hole or a series of pockets like you might as a wade fisherman. So they can get away with a little bit more alarming rig and a little bit more noise because they're gonna be in fresh water in several seconds. So it's very, very different for somebody who's in a boat like me. When I'm guiding a lot of the time, I may want to use the traditional thingamabob or Oros airlock, family of indicators. Anymore, I still guide exclusively over yarn because I want to see people get to that upper echelon of angling skill. But we can scale our indicators to match our fly size. You're going to use a little trial and error all the way up to a pretty big rig. Again, you're going to comb that out. You're gonna put just Loon Aquel floating on there, and now I've got a big rig capable of handling 2 nymphs or a stonefly or a little sculpin or something like that. Now, when it comes to making these rigs, you can go New Zealand style. Like I said, you can just reference, we have videos on our website on that product page to see how to set that up. But I'm gonna give you the version I do. I keep it super simple. This all stays in a little envelope like this. It's a little fish pond envelope. This is my indicator stash. This comes out like so. I'm rigging up for the day, and let's just say I'm gonna run just a single little stonefly nymph. Anywhere in the West, that's usually what I start with when it comes to just getting the fish. So I can take one strand of this yarn. I can take the butt section of my leader. If you're using a tapered leader, you just try to feel your fingers down to where it gets down in kind of that diameter that's just a little heavier than you're gonna be fishing. And you can put your tippet ring in, and then all I'm gonna do is make an overhand knot like so. It's just a half hitch, that's all it is. There's nothing tricky going on here. And I put that yarn right in the middle. It's kind of awkward holding it out and doing it on video, and that's it. There's nothing on there that sinks. It's a delicate flower, it's a delicate feather. So there's nothing on there that sinks. My indicator's on, I built it that fast. I do recommend you get a comb. If you don't want to buy one from us, go get a lice comb at your local Rite Aid, okay, or out of your medicine cabinet, you filthy animal. So you just comb it out. That one was kind of hasty, but I like to take those and then I trim them real square at the top, make them look pretty. That's an example of the average size that I would typically run, just like that. But I think in the world of fly fishing and just trying to help do-it-yourself anglers be stronger anglers, be more successful, and then also just find the most enjoyment that they can out of fly fishing and fly casting, these rigs cast really well. You get great line speed, you get great distance, and like I said, there's a reason when anglers are fishing on foot for high-stakes trout in New Zealand, all they're running is yarn. And that doesn't mean Doesn't mean we're going to catch 10-pound brown trout out here, but everybody has their own local New Zealand. Like, try to get the most out of it that you possibly can. But I find that to be a huge advantage. I can scale my indicators up and down. A little box like this, that's 100 indicators in there. Get yourself a little stash. You can experiment with different types of yarn. I use a lot of Poly Pro yarn. You can even buy that at craft stores if you want to really like go on a deep dive. And then the last thing I'll show you is, maybe this is like, you're like, holy crap, Joe, this is like way too much for me, is the Loon tip topper. I keep a handful of these, and sometimes, especially if it's a little rainy and I just need to get an indicator on quick before it gets saturated in a heavy rainstorm, the Loon tip topper system is really great. They're really good yarn. Sometimes I'll even cut these and open it and just use the yarn. But I'll show you really quickly how to put the Loon tip topper on. It is very easy. Let me get the other end of my line here. In fact, I'm just going to cut a piece off. And I'll show you how to put the tip topper on, because if you want just a starting point, and in the whole scheme of this stuff's cheap. It's not going to cost you a lot to just experiment a little bit and get yourself a package of tip toppers. But to put the tip topper on, we just fold the leader over like so. There's a little rubber O-ring. It's very thin. And I just fold it over the top, pull it down against the O-ring like so, so that my leader is meeting leader. And I've got my Loon tip topper on there. Throw a little floating on that, you're good to go. You could still run a tippet ring, or if you're not wanting to get tippet rings and you want to try this weekend, for instance, you can actually tie a little tiny perfection loop in the end of this. And I'm just going to tie kind of a crude one right now. And I'll show you what that looks like. And I do this a lot, especially if I don't feel like digging out a tippet ring. I like the tippet ring if I'm setting up for kind of an all-day venture. If I'm just going to nymph, throw a nymph and test the waters a little bit, sometimes I'll just go just like that. But now I've got a little tiny tippet ring right there. So now I could loop my terminal tippet right into the tippet ring, and I've got essentially a junction point to where if I did need to retie or I broke off or something like that, I could do that. And you can slide that Loon tip topper all the way down to your tippet ring right there. That way I've got nothing but my fine tippet that's going to my fly all the way down, and that tends to present a lot better. I really like to suspend my nymphs. I'm not a big bounce the nymphs along the bottom with my strike indicators. If I want to get on the bottom, I'm going to have much finer control, contact, or tight line nymphing with a technical rod because I'm going to lose way less flies. Anglers that dredge and cover the bottom with two nymphs under an indicator rig, you're going to snag a lot. That's going to make a lot of noise. It's going to disturb a lot of fish, and you're going to lose a lot of flies because your tippet is physically laying along the bottom a lot of the time. And if you have two nymphs, you get one nymph that goes around one side of a rock, one nymph that goes around the other. Pretty soon you're snagged up, you're yanking the line, you're making noise, you're busting off, and now you're standing on the shore retying your line when you could have a fish on, learning to suspend your nymphs. It's a little bit more delicate, more technical style fishing, which I really appreciate. But one of the things about yarn is this is delicate and it flutters down to the water. When it comes to getting to that next level as far as fly fishing and that technical casting, a lot of times what we're doing with these yarn rigs is we're throwing tuck casts where our fly hits the water first and our fly makes a little splat on the water. We're not hammer casting it, but we're just making sure the fly hits first. And then these yarn indicators, we can control where these things wander and flare. So if I want my indicator to just gently flutter and flare upstream for a particular presentation, I can do it. If I want my indicator to flare downstream, I can do it. And then what happens is that nymph starts to kind of spiral and corkscrew its way down while that indicator is just fluttering down to the water. And you're going to get a much better drift, especially in very tight technical pockets that are swift, where there is no time for a mend. You've got to drop it in ready to fish. So that little tuck cast with a nice stop on the rod, kicking that nymph over and letting that delicate yarn indicator flare over the top of it, you're going to be able to extract some really nice fish out of those really tough spots where no mend is even possible. By the time you throw it in there and your line is laying and it's stretched out in the current, my indicator's in one speed, my fly's in the other, and I'm like, okay, I go to mend it. A lot of times I'm out of those really tight, swift pockets. With this, I can just fire a tuck cast right into a, let that indicator delicately hover down, and then I can go right into a high stick or just a very delicate anchor mend where I can pick this thing up like the little feather that it is, and I can kick that yarn back into the eddy. The amount of technical mending you can do, because this thing is weightless, I can now mend and position this to any position in the river I want, and my weighted fly acts as the pivot point. So now this is being mended all over the place depending on where I want to go. So there are many technical advantages once that thing is on the water in how you mend and how you can cast and deliver the goods, so to speak. But I find especially helpful in those really tight, technical, fast pockets, underbrush, long cliff walls, in technical pocket water, and especially on cut banks where we've really got to drive that fly under and get the indicator along the cut bank so that they can track harmoniously with one another along the shoreline.